Some winters are remembered for what fell from the sky. This one was remembered for what refused to rise from the ground. In the autumn of 1887, the wells of a small Wyoming county began failing one after another, and the only water left standing in 15 miles belonged to a woman the town had spent 2 summers mocking for owning it before anyone believed it was there. The widow Ansel lived where the road stopped pretending to be a road and became 2 ruts through sage. Folks in town called her that before they called her anything else. The widow Ansel said the way a man says a fact he has stopped examining. It took most of them a moment longer to recall that she had a first name, and that the name was Judith, and that she had been Judith Vance before she was Judith Ansel, and that both names had once meant something to somebody. She was 44 years old in the autumn this story begins. She had buried a husband, a father, and 1 infant daughter in the same square of fenced ground behind her cabin, and she had done all 3 burials herself, with a spade she still used every spring to turn the garden. The year was 1887. The place was a stretch of high, dry range 15 miles north of a town called Kareen, which does not appear on many maps now, and did not deserve to appear on many then. She had come to that land with her husband Elias Ansel in the spring of 1871. Elias had been a quiet, particular man, the kind who read almanacs the way other men read scripture, and who kept a leather notebook of observations that most of the county considered eccentric at best. He had died of a fever in the winter of 1879, and Judith had stayed on the land rather than sell it, which the town found strange, and had run it alone rather than remarry, which the town found stranger still. She kept 4 milk goats, a small flock of hens, a garden that produced more than a garden that size had any right to, and a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin that Elias had begun the year before he died, and never finished. She finished it herself, over 2 winters, working by lantern light with a pick and a shovel and a stubbornness the county had no polite word for. She did not go to church often, and when she did, she sat in the back and left before the social hour, which some called grief and others called pride, and neither was quite right. The truth, plain and unremarkable, was that she had work to do, and the social hour did not do it for her. By the summer of 1887, the drought had already been 3 years building. Old-timers spoke of it the way men speak of a debt they know is coming due, but have not yet been asked to pay. The grass on the open range had gone the color of a coyote's coat by July. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Kareen, which had run every year anyone could remember, thinned to a trickle you could step across without wetting your boot. Men dug their wells deeper, and for a while it worked, and then it stopped working. The way a rope stops holding weight not gradually, but all at once, at the exact point past which it was never going to hold at all. Judith's well, dug the same year as her husband's death, had gone dry in the spring of 1886. She had not dug it deeper. She had, instead, walked the far corner of her land, a low place near a stand of chokecherry that nobody had ever thought to build near, because it flooded in wet years and stayed muddy longer than a sensible man wanted to deal with, and she had begun to dig there instead. Not a well, something else. The county did not know what to call it, and so it called it nothing. And mostly, it did not think about Judith Ansel's digging at all, until it had reason to. That reason would come, but it would come slowly, the way most true things come, through a summer of small cruelties before it came through a winter of large ones. The cruelty started, as it often does, with a sound she was not meant to hear. It was August, and the well behind the general store had begun to show sand in its bucket, a sign every rancher in the county knew and dreaded. Judith had gone into Kareen for salt and coffee, and while she stood at the counter, 3 women from the church auxiliary were gathered near the dry goods, their voices pitched low in the particular register women use, when they intend to be overheard by exactly one person and no others. Mrs. Pruitt, whose husband ran the mill, said that some folks dug in strange places because strange was the only company they had left. Mrs. Whitfield, the schoolteacher's mother, said nothing at all, which was its own kind of agreement. And the schoolteacher herself, a young woman named Alma Reyes, who had come out from Ohio the previous year and had not yet learned the difference between wit and unkindness, said these lines that stayed. She said that the widow Ansel dug holes the way other women kept diaries, for company and to no useful end. Judith paid for her salt and her coffee. She did not turn around. She carried both parcels out to her wagon, and she drove the 15 miles home in the heat with her jaw set in a line that had nothing to do with the sun, and when she reached her land, she did not sit down to rest. She went to the low ground by the chokecherry. and she picked up her spade, and she worked until the light went out of the sky. That was her only answer to any of them, that summer or any summer. She kept working. It was not defiance exactly. It was closer to the truth that she had never once asked their permission to begin. What she was building in that low corner of her land was not a well in the way the county understood wells. Elias had left her something in the last winter of his life. Not money, there had been none of that, but a leather notebook filled with his small, careful hand, observations he had made walking the land in every season for 8 years. Late in that notebook, in an entry from a wet spring 3 years before his death, he had written about the chokecherry stand and the way the ground near it never fully dried even in the driest months, and about a Shoshone man he had once shared a fire with on a trapping trip north, who had told him that where chokecherry and certain low grasses grew thick together year after year without help, water was moving beneath the ground, slow and steady, deeper than any surface well would show. Elias had underlined the word beneath twice. He had written, in the margin, a note that Judith found only after his death, tucked into a page about grain storage. If I do not live to dig it, someone should. She had read that line perhaps 400 times in 8 years. She had decided finally that someone was her. The building of it took the better part of 2 summers. It was not a well shaft, straight and narrow, the way the county dug its wells. It was closer to a spring house built downward, instead of up, a wide, gently sloped excavation that followed the natural fall of the land toward the chokecherry stand. Lined first with stone, she hauled herself from a dry creek bed a mile off, then packed with clay, she dug from a seam on the north side of her property that she had also learned of from Elias's notebook. The stone kept the walls from collapsing. The clay, packed in careful layers and left to cure between rains that came rarely enough, that curing was not a problem, kept the water that gathered there from simply draining back into the thirsty ground around it. It was, in effect, a cistern that filled itself, drawing not from rain, but from whatever slow vein moved beneath the chokecherry roots, exactly as the Shoshone man had told her husband it would. She lined the approach to it with bramble, wild rose and blackberry cane, thick and thorned, planted deliberately along the windward side. It was not decoration. Elias's notebook had a second note, in a different ink, added later, describing something an old trapper had told him about bramble thickets holding snow and breaking wind in a way that kept the ground beneath them from freezing as hard or as deep as open ground nearby. Judith had tested it herself over 2 winters, driving a stake into open ground and another beneath the bramble, and pulling both after a hard freeze to compare how far the frost had reached. The stake beneath the bramble came up with soft ground still clinging to its base a full 8 inches past, where the open ground had frozen solid. She did not know the words for what she had proven. She only knew that it worked, and that was enough for a woman with no one to explain it to. She planted her garden, too, in a way the county found peculiar, corn and beans, and squashed together in the same mounded rows, a method she had learned from a note pressed between the pages of her mother-in-law's old cookbook, describing how the tall corn shielded the low squash from wind and sun, both, how the beans fed the soil the corn exhausted, how the broad squash leaves shaded the ground and kept what little moisture there was from lifting off into the dry air. It was not her invention. She never claimed it as one. But she was, as far as anyone in that county knew, the only one still practicing it, because everyone else had long since decided that rows in straight lines were the modern way and the only way, and had stopped asking why their gardens burned by July while hers did not. She stored her grain, too, according to a method scrawled in a different hand entirely, in a letter she kept folded inside the cookbook itself, written by Elias's mother back in Ohio, describing how grain packed with dried chaff between the walls of a storage bin, rather than left to sit in open sacks, held steady through hard freezes that would otherwise ruin sacked grain from the moisture that gathered and turned to ice within it. The chaff, packed thick, did what wool batting does in a coat. It held still air, and still air held warmth, or at least held out the worst of the cold. And Judith's grain came through her second winter alone unspoiled, while half the county's sacked grain, exposed in drafty sheds, went to rot and freeze by February. None of this she explained to anyone. No one asked. By the first week of September, the smoke from 3 chimneys near the eastern edge of town had begun rising thinner than it should have for the season. A small thing Judith noticed, only because her cabin sat on a rise that let her see the whole shallow valley below, chimney by chimney, the way a woman watches a row of lamps to know who in a house is still awake. Thinner smoke in September meant men rationing wood before winter had even asked them to. It was the first small signal that something in the county's preparation was already going wrong. Weeks before anyone in Corinne would have said so out loud, the drought broke, if it could be called breaking, in the third week of October, with an early hard freeze instead of rain. The ground that had baked all summer locked solid overnight, the way it does in a bad year, before the first real snow had even come to soften it. Judith woke that morning to the particular silence a hard freeze brings. No wind, no birdsong, only the tight creak of frost-bound wood settling somewhere in her cabin walls, and she went out before full light to check the low ground by the chokecherry. The water in her cistern stood exactly where it had stood the week before. Cold at the surface, but moving still, unfrozen a foot down, exactly as Elias's notebook had said it would. She did not know, that morning, how quickly the county's shallower wells would follow the creek into ruin. She would learn it the way she learned most things that autumn. From a distance, through smoke and silence, and the movement of strangers she had not expected to see. The first stranger came on a gray afternoon in late October, a boy of perhaps 12 she did not recognize, walking his family's mule along the road below her cabin with 2 empty water barrels lashed to its back. He did not stop at her gate. He did not look up toward the cabin at all. He simply walked past, slow and steady, towards some destination she could not guess, and Judith stood at her window and watched him go, and felt the first cold weight of understanding settle into her stomach. A boy walking a mule with empty barrels, this far out, this late in the day, was not running an errand. He was searching. 2 days later, the smoke from the Hendersons' chimney, which she had watched rise every evening for 11 years without missing a single night, did not rise at all. She stood at her window longer than she meant to, watching the pale, empty square of sky where that smoke should have been, and she told herself it might be nothing. A chimney needing sweeping, a family gone to visit kin in town, but she had lived on that rise long enough to know the shape of an ordinary absence. And this did not have that shape. This had the shape of something wrong. She did not go to see. That was not yet her place, and she knew it, though the knowing sat uneasily in her chest all through supper and into the long dark of the evening after. By the first week of November, the signals had stopped being small. A rider passed on the road below her cabin 3 times in 4 days, always heading the same direction, always at speed, and riders at speed on that road in November meant news, and news at speed rarely meant good news. She heard, secondhand, from the boy who delivered her mail once a fortnight, that the well behind the mill had gone to mud, and that 2 more shallow wells on the east side had followed it within days, and that the town council had begun rationing what remained from the one deep well still producing, a slow trickle shared out by the bucket, morning and evening, under a system that Judith gathered was already causing more argument than water. She heard too, though not from anyone who meant her to hear it, that her name had come up in one of those arguments. Someone, she never learned who, and did not especially want to, had remembered the widow Ansel's strange digging by the chokecherry stand, the thing the whole county had spent 2 summers treating as a private eccentricity not worth its attention, and had wondered aloud, in the cold arithmetic of a town running out of water, whether that eccentricity might in fact be something else. No one came to ask her about it. Not yet. Pride is a slow traveler on a frontier road, and it had a long distance yet to cover before it would knock on a widow's door and ask for anything. She kept working through all of it. That was the whole of her answer, then as before. Not silence exactly, but a kind of steady motion that did not pause to receive an apology it had not been offered. She hauled water from her cistern to her goats and her hens twice a day. She checked the bramble line along the north edge of her cistern approach after each freeze, packing snow where the wind had thinned it, because she had learned that the insulation only held if she tended it, and tending it was not a burden to her, only a task, the same as any other. She split wood in the mornings before the cold set too deep into her hands to grip an axe well. She read, some evenings, from Elias's notebook, not for new information now, but for the company of his handwriting, and she noticed, on one of those evenings, a passage she had somehow read past a dozen times before without truly seeing. A line noting that the chokecherry vein, in the driest years he had observed, ran strongest not in high summer but in the weeks just after the first hard freeze, when the ground above it locked tight and stopped losing what little moisture remained to the dry autumn air. She sat with that line a long while. It meant, if her husband had read the land rightly, that her cistern would only grow more reliable as the county's crisis deepened, not less. It was a strange thing to feel gratitude toward a dead man's handwriting on a cold night, with the frost ticking against the window glass. But she felt it plainly, and did not examine it further. The second week of November brought the cliffhanger she would remember longest, not because it was the loudest signal, but because it was the closest. She was gathering eggs near dusk when she heard, faint but unmistakable across the still air, the sound of a church bell ringing out of its proper hour, not the slow toll of a Sunday service, but a short, urgent, broken rhythm she had heard only twice before in her life, both times for fire. She stood in the yard with the egg basket cooling against her hip, straining to place the source of it, and could not. Corinne's bell, or something like it, but she could not tell whether it rang for a fire, or for a gathering, or for something she had no name for yet, and she went to bed that night, with the sound still turning over in her mind, unresolved, the county 15 miles below her, going about some business she could not see, and would not learn the shape of until strangers brought it to her door themselves. The strangers came, as it happened, 3 days later, on a morning cold enough that her breath hung in the cabin doorway like a curtain she had to walk through. She had already begun heating water for the goats when she heard the wagon on the road, moving slower than the boy's mule had moved, slower than the riders had moved, the particular unhurried pace of people who did not want to arrive at the place they were arriving at. She went to the window. 3 figures on the wagon bench, bundled against the cold, and behind them 2 more on horseback, and she recognized, even at that distance, the shape of Mrs. Pruitt's shawl and the schoolteacher Alma Reyes, sitting stiff and small beside her, and she felt something in her chest that was not quite triumph and was not quite anger, and did not yet have a name. She thought, standing at that window with the kettle beginning to whistle behind her, of the summer just past, and the counter at the general store, and the sentence about diaries and holes and useful ends. She thought, too, of Elias's note in the margin, "If I do not live to dig it, someone should," and of how little that sentence had ever had to do with anyone's opinion of her. She did not wait for them to knock. She was standing in her open doorway before the wagon had fully stopped, a shawl over her shoulders, and the kettle's steam still rising behind her into the cold morning air, and the 3 women on the wagon bench sat frozen for a moment in the particular stillness of people who have rehearsed an apology and find, at the threshold, that the words have gone thin in their mouths. It was Mrs. Pruitt who finally spoke, and what she said was not an apology at all, only a small, plain question about whether the widow Ansel's spring still ran. Judith looked at her a long moment. Then she looked past her to Alma Reyes, pale and silent in the back of the wagon, and to the men on horseback she now recognized as 2 of the town's dry, defeated well diggers. And she stepped back from the door and said the only sentence she would speak in this whole account, the only words the county would ever get from her about any of it. "There's coffee on. Bring your barrels round back." She did not say it warmly, and she did not say it coldly. She said it the way a woman states a fact that has always been true and requires no further comment, and then she turned and went back inside to see to the kettle, leaving the door open behind her, and one by one, stiff with cold and something harder to name, they followed her in. She fed them that morning, stores she had built through 2 summers, no one had thought worth watching. Bread from grain that had never frozen, preserves from a garden that had never burned, coffee heated over a fire fed by wood she had split with her own hands in the weeks when the county still had wood to spare, and had spared none of it thinking of her. She filled their barrels from a cistern. The whole town had once found a fit subject for jokes at a dry goods counter, and she said nothing about any of that, then or later, because there was nothing in her that wanted to say it. She had not built any of it to be thanked. She had built it because a man she had loved left her a half-finished thing and a single underlined word, and because the ground does not care whether a woman is respected before it decides to give her water. Winter closed in fully after that, hard and long, the way the old-timers had warned it might. But it closed in on a county that no longer had to wonder where its water stood. The line to Judith Ansel's cistern became, by December, a quiet daily fixture of the valley below her cabin, a rope of footprints in the snow, leading from town to the low ground by the chokecherry stand, and back again, morning and evening, the same rhythm she had once kept alone. She never asked anyone to thank her, and mostly they did not in words. But she noticed, that winter and after, that the smoke rose steady from every chimney in the valley, and that no boy walked an empty barrel down her road again. And that when spring finally came and the frost pulled back from the ground and the bramble along her cistern's edge put out its first thin green, the county's memory of a widow's strange digging had quietly rearranged itself into something closer to respect, though no one ever said the word aloud, and she never once asked them to. Preparation is not stubbornness. It is a form of love, For the people who will need you when they finally admit they do. If this story stays with you, the next one is already waiting.